Welcome to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf. Today, our special guest is author Jill Ruschli Crane with her first book, Glenview Prohibition, Bootleggers and Boondoggles. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Jill, what motivated you to write this book?
Well, I had grown up with stories about Glenview because my mother grew up here, and about some of the crazier things that happened in Glenview and some of the bars and some of the gangsters that were around in the 20s and the 30s. And somewhere along the line, I heard about this murder in Glenview. And this is after my father said that my mother sat on Bugs Moran's knee. And I thought, well, I kind of have an exciting past here. And so I looked into it.
What are you missing out, right?
Right, I need to find out more. And then eventually I got involved with Ancestry and then wanted to research Glenview. I also worked as a hostess in a local bar and restaurant, and he moved and was wondering how he could redecorate the bar. So we came up with this idea of getting all the old taverns in Glenview, and then I could write a little something under them. So that's what I thought, boy, if I could do that, maybe I should write a book about this, and about these different taverns in the area and some of the things that happened. And that got me researching.
Well, Jill, it sounds like it's a doable project, right? Not too many bars and taverns, or was it much more?
At the time, it was very doable because I thought, okay, well, there's 4 or 5 places in Glenview.
Right.
I also wanted to stretch it into Morton Grove because there were a few places there. My father owned a tavern in Skokie, and I thought I could include that. And by the time I got to the publisher, they said, oh, no, just do Glenview. But there are parts of the book that involve some of these other areas. I also go into the history of Prohibition and a little bit of history of Glenview and the bars in Glenview. Like Glenview was a day's ride from Chicago before cars. And so they had lodging places and, of course, a place to have a beer or whatever.
It's convenient.
Yeah.
Well, so who was it that got murdered? Now that really piqued my interest.
Well, 10 years after Prohibition started, because until the early part of Glenview, there was a certain bootlegger, Matt Hoffman, who was just a jolly guy. Everybody loved him. And he got a man from Luxembourg to come to the United States to help him make beer. So he had these, so he made beer originally in his basement, and then he had a tavern in his garage, and pretty soon he had so much beer, he bought another tavern on Chestnut and Waukegan, and
so he was doing very well for himself.
Oh, he was doing really well and selling beer to all these Glenview places, as well as to private homes in Winnetka, Wilmette, and Kenilworth.
But does the word bootlegger, does it mean like an outlaw, or what
bootlegger, the term, I found, when I researched this, I found several
connotation, right?
For bootlegger. But the one that sounded the best to me was during the Civil War, the soldiers would hide knives and sometimes bottles of booze in their boots.
Yeah.
And so
that's where the term came from.
That's where the term came from.
Well, okay. So it didn't mean that you were making alcohol illegally. It wasn't that, not like a lawbreaker type of meaning?
Well, by the time the 20s came, it was actually
applied that way.
That way. And bootleggers at the time, Glenview was a very little town. There weren't even 800 people here. And they were mostly farmers. And the few businesses there were like a little stores or like these lodges.
Can't believe it. 800 people.
That's it.
That's probably one class. That's smaller than the graduating class of the high school.
Yes.
Okay, right now. The Glenbrook South. There's that many people.
Yes.
Okay. So that gives us an idea. So everybody knew each other.
Everyone knew each other, and Yes, everyone knew each other. It was this, you know, this small town feeling. Everybody helped each other out. And Charles Rugen, I think, was like, I don't want to say a la-di-da, but he owned a store in Glenview, a department store, Rugen's.
Yes.
And then the people in Glenview, the farmers, would have money that they didn't want to keep in their house, and they didn't want to give it to another bank. So Charles Rugen pretty soon opened up. He said, "Well, come on, put it in my safe, and I'll, you know, and
keep it for you.
And I'll keep it for you." And anyway, that was in 1920. By 1921, he had built a building and had a real bank, which I was here for years. I know, especially I walked by it every day when I went to school. And so here's Charles Rugen doing all these wonderful things for Glenview. And then there's Frank Egan, who in Frank Engels, who in 1924 opened the Lake Street Tavern. And so you would think that those two people would be, I don't know, culturally far away from each other. But Glenview was very into baseball, and they were both baseball partners in baseball, like Glenview commissioners in baseball.
Wow.
So people, got along.
Got along. The same type of partnership and friendship that we see now in Glenview.
Yes.
Now, but when this prohibition came along,
started.
Yeah, was it very strictly enforced by the law?
That's interesting. Glenview's prohibition throughout the nation started in 1920. The law was passed in 1919. Now, before that time, there were many prohibition movements throughout the nation. There was one very much along the North Shore. And so actually starting in 1850s, the people who started Northwestern University, which before that was Garrett College, were very religious. So what they built into their charter was no booze shall be sold, no liquor can be sipped within 4 miles of our college.
4 miles.
And
so the dry campus or in
dry? Yes, dry. And so along the lakefront, the people that settled along the lakefront were, yes, we don't want any taverns. We don't want that riffraff in our neighborhoods. So Glenview was, even before they were all selling beer and things just west of Ridge Road. Along Ridge Road was a little town called Grosse Pointe. They had 15 bars for 1,000 people.
Wow.
And this little town survived because all these bars had to pay the village $500. But then, when this temperance movement came into the area in 1909, and
1909?
1909 was in this area. I'm trying to explain that
the background.
The background, and there were temperance movements all over. But the temperance movement around here was on, closer to the lake, and those people didn't like drinkers. They weren't so crazy about immigrants. So the Germans that had settled along Grosse Pointe and had all these bars, because the Germans drank a lot. They drank, their beer festivals
it's part
and
of
things.
Their culture. And I remember going to Wilmette's History House, and they did an exhibit on that, on the Germans who were, they were the new immigrants, and they were shut down during the temperance movement or during Prohibition. So it made it very hard for the German immigrants.
And actually, the Germans were here before the town was established further east.
That's crazy.
The Germans they kind of started it, and they built churches. They were responsible for New Trier High School. I mean, these were hard-working people. And then they had their beer.
But they ended up on the wrong side of the law. And then they can't continue
and so all their taverns were shut down. And then it took about 10 years, because then the town really had no money. I mean, it was just farmers. And farmers can't really give you $500 a year. So pretty soon the town shut down and became part of Wilmette. But that was along Ridge Road. And anyways, so when in 1909, when they said no more booze, and the bar owners in Grosse Pointe Road, you and I talked about one who committed suicide. And his wife is, it's just all your fault. We had a perfectly fine little business going on, and now what are we going to do? So when the people were lamenting and the bars were closed down, somebody said, that's okay, let's go to Glenview because they haven't heard of the Volstead Act. And so they...
so life is, it could be good again.
Yes, and the closest tavern was Myers Tavern. And,
yes, yeah.
And then the Lake Street Tavern further down on Lake and Waukegan. And if you read a lot of their histories, they say they opened in 1931 or 1932, which is when Prohibition was ending. But no, they were around
way
in the
before
early
that.
20s. Yeah.
They just can't have that on.
Right.
So,
Yes.
So let's say about the law enforcement. Was it something that was very much monitored?
Well, Glenview had 3 policemen.
Okay.
And the
people. Okay.
And the policemen were friends of some of these people that own these, saloons and taverns. Yeah. And so I think it was hard for them to go in and say, you're closing down. Yeah. And especially because all their other friends and parents and cousins were there drinking.
Uncles, yeah. So it wasn't, it was just, they just let it.
They just kind of let it happen.
And there were some businesses that didn't sell any liquor?
I think there were some, I didn't find any research that the Glenview House sold liquor.
Oh, that's the one we usually think of. That must be,
yes,
right?
Because it was the first one. But then there were ones that oddly in the 20s they would have these advertisements, and this is in Glenview, these big bars, and come and we have dancing and we have bands every night and we have food. Chinese food was big at the time.
Yes, I know about that. So funny, yes. So then let's see, so this prohibition, this time, how did you begin to start your research? Because the incubation period was probably
2 years. 2 years, and really all I had was an idea that my father telling me in 1931 this guy was murdered at Hackney's on Harms.
Yeah.
And so I thought, because my dad was such a storyteller, I thought, maybe I should check this out and see if that really happened.
Yes.
So Glenview newspapers were pretty iffy, if not non-existent during certain years. And so you had to go to like something called the Herald that was established for 7 or 8 suburbs, and you might get a column from Glenview. And the column mostly said things like, this family met that family and they had Sunday dinner together.
Really?
And then
a story like a murder. We would think it would be headlines.
And yes, and there would be very little on it, especially anything, a lot of the stuff I found was recorded like in Gray's Lake. You would find the article in a Gray's Lake paper. Oh, but the murders,
that kind
I
of
found,
research.
yes, I found in the Tribune. And so then, and the Tribune had just great information, except once the murder was over, then it kind of ended. You never did find out what really happened unless they caught somebody. And in case of the murders in Glenview, they never caught anybody. They realized that this Matt Hoffman, who was murdered at Hackney's on Harms, they think that was the Roger Toohey gang, because Roger Toohey he was a horrible guy. He wrote a book, and in the book he tells you what a great guy he was, and he did all these wonderful things, and friends with Anton Cermak, and just this great guy. He wanted Matt Hoffman to quit selling beer in Glenview, and he said to Matt, quit. And then and Matt was like, Glenview's my town, I'll do whatever I want. And so Roger Toohey and his gang would go to Matt Hoffman's home.
Wow.
And he had 3 little babies, and he'd like shine the lights and and gun his motor and harass these people.
Put a little pressure there.
It was a lot.
And that's not the only murder in your book.
About 9 months before Matt was murdered at Hackney's on Harms, there was a murder in the Lake Street Tavern, which eventually became Hackney's on Lake. And this man came into the bar around midnight, and he knew Frank Engels, the bartender, and the owner. He knew them. So it's midnight, and this man's wife was in the hospital having a baby. And he's telling Frank Engels, oh, my wife's having a baby. And all of a sudden, 2 men came in the front door, and 2 other men came in the side door, and they said, put your hands up. And this man whose wife was having a baby said, what, you must be joking. And they shot him. And then after they shot him, they stepped over his body and said to Frank Engels, open your safe, let's see what you have. And it was just, that was a brutal time. A few days before that, this same person who shot Thompson was involved with another shooting in a bar in Summit. And it wasn't until really 1985, when records became available, that it was discovered that that was Babyface Nelson. So the guy was just like trigger happy.
Yes. So you're talking. So Jill, it sounds like your book is not just a nonfiction. It sounds like it sounds like a Western. It sounds like a crime novel. And the kind of, were you expecting to? Oh,
no.
You were looking for it, right? You were trying to verify some stories from your father.
I was trying to verify the story, and then along the line, I came at Hackney's at the Lake Street Tavern,
yes.
which is Hackney's on Harms. A few months before that, somebody came in and they said, we're holding you up. And they said to Mrs. Engels, Betty Engels, go get your husband, because they lived upstairs. Yeah. So she goes upstairs to get her husband, and they drag him downstairs and open your safe, we want your money. And then meanwhile, another couple from the North Shore walks in thinking they're going to have lunch, and these robbers tied them up too and took all their money. But things like this happened. And
I guess
and it was, yes, things like this happened. And so it was really, while these bars like Engels were selling food and selling booze, and by the way, having liquor licenses with the county and the village, they were taking all the risk, because anything could happen and somebody could come in and rob them like this.
I see.
So
they, wow, this sounds like exciting times, but
I think scary. I mean, exciting, I think, for us looking back, but
but for farmers, well, you don't want any of that.
Yeah, exactly. You just want to go and have your beer at the end of the day, and maybe take your wife in and listen to music, and that was one of the byproducts of Prohibition. Until Prohibition, women never went in bars.
No.
And I mean, if you had any sort of respect for yourself, you never went into a bar.
You would not be in the bar.
And then Prohibition, all the women are in there and they're smoking and drinking and partying away. And then after Prohibition, when Prohibition ended and they made regulations then, but women were still going to bars then.
So tell me about was this something your mother told you about or your grandmother told you about? Because you sound like you were there. That's how I'm impressed with this story.
I was fascinated by my grandmother. My grandmother was not my mother's mother was not your baking cookies and reading book stories. My grandmother loved going to the racetrack, and she loved drinking. And she loved telling stories. So when she would come to visit, she would sit at our kitchen table and just tell all these stories about these different people.
Bar stories. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
and
I was a needlepoint.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And but she was kind of a trip. She wanted to be an actress. And my mother later said, and I don't know if this is true, because my mom said, she would sit at Hackney's waiting for like a movie director to come in and discover her. Yeah. And it obviously never happened.
Yeah, but those stories we heard too at, soda, at, what's it called, the pharmacies where they make soda.
Oh, yeah,
fountains,
pharmacies.
Right?
Yes, and they would, the pharmacies could sell, during Prohibition, the pharmacies could sell alcohol if you needed it. Okay, if you were having a little nervous breakdown and you needed you needed it, then you could get a prescription from a doctor and buy booze.
Sounds like, yeah.
Another
CBD
thing
now.
What?
Also like marijuana now, right?
Yeah, kind
Like
of.
the,
Yeah.
medicinal, or but then
For medicinal reasons, you can.
Yeah.
And then also the clergy, because wine
yes.
figured in
mass and everything.
Mass and also Jewish holidays. So pretty soon, even these bootleggers, and they weren't all connected with the mob, would make deals with the
Clergy, yeah.
with the clergy and with the drugstores, and how much can you give me? And
Oh, that's very interesting.
yeah.
Not the way we think black and white about who's on the right or wrong side of law. Oh.
It wasn't really. I think especially in small towns like Glenview, where there, until these two murders, it wasn't this shoot 'em up gang thing. It was just, speakeasies, where small little places would, in fact, Myers Tavern opened up. He moved to Myers Tavern, and they would have friends over to have a few beers, and then they had to add on to their living room because more friends were coming over to buy beers and make, they made hamburgers and sandwiches, and that happened at Hackney's on Harms too.
Yeah.
It was just a few people would go in to buy beers, and little by little it grew.
It grew. So as you're telling me these stories, Jill, I'm thinking, how did you edit your book? I mean, it just seemed like a monstrous project to keep it small.
It was. As I said before, they wanted 30,000 words. The book is 38,000 words. Plus, I wanted footnotes in it.
You have to almost,
it's
right?
like
With
5
all the
pages
photos, I see lots of photos in there.
Photos, and half of the photos didn't make it because they just weren't clear enough to put into a book.
That's true.
But it was tough. In fact, there was another part to the book about Glenview had an airport before the Glenview Naval Air Station.
Really?
Yes, and it was called Curtis Reynolds Airport. And that was that was going to be a couple of chapters. And then the editor and I said, that's just not going to work. So now I'm writing that book. That book's halfway written. And
you have enough for 2 books.
I had enough for 2 books. And but in this book, the Prohibition book, I wanted to get in Roosevelt Pool because...
Tell us about Roosevelt.
Because I grew up there. My sister and I went there every single day when we were little kids. And it opened in 1940. And I call it the boondoggle because Glenview was politically very conservative. And FDR had all these different programs, the New Deal programs. Yes. And one of them was, building a swimming pool for Glenview. Wow. And the deal was Glenview had to put up part of the money and had to supply people who were out of work to work on this pool. Right. Well, Glenview supplied the $5,000 they needed because they had this Glenview Days going on for years before that. So they were able to put together this $5,000, but they had to bus in workers because there weren't enough people in Glenview out of work. Wow.
That's funny. That's funny
because they were working. Because they were working.
Yeah.
So anyway, so then they built this pool, which was a very unusual pool. I think there's only 9 other in the United States. This concept of a round pool, and it starts at 0, and then the deep end is in the middle. And Roosevelt right now is the only one continuously running.
That's amazing.
They made some changes.
Yeah, with all the remodeling, I thought it came with the remodeling, but it was originally...
It was originally a round pool. It was originally had sand. It had sand on the edge of the pool, and it was called the beach away from the lake. And I guess the sand just started clogging all the plumbing in there.
That's how you remembered it, right?
It wasn't sand when I was a little girl, so that was one of my surprises when I was doing the research. They had sand? How could they have sand? But they had slides and different diving boards, and but my sister and I spent every minute there when we were kids.
Oh,
it was a wonderful place.
It is a wonderful memory.
And so my sister and I went back a couple of years ago to relive our childhood. Well, when we went to Roosevelt Pool, you had a bathing cap and your bathing suit, and that was it. You couldn't take a towel in. You couldn't take anything in. So, in fact, when we were little kids, because of that, we'd ride our bicycles over with no shoes on, no towel, no nothing, and then go swim, lay out on the cement to dry off, and then go home. So then when Jan and I went a few years ago, oh, they sell food there. They have chairs. You bring in your towels, your suntan lotion, your Coca-Colas.
You can spend a whole day there without being hungry.
Right, exactly.
Wow.
But it was a great place. And in the book I discuss the water shows and things, which were big Glenview attractions. And
wow. Jill, what is your message for our writers out there?
I think the message would be, because I don't even know if I consider myself a writer. I was more of a reporter. But it would be love your topic, because you are with it day and night for at least, in my case, 2 years, over 2 years. Doing the research, doing the writing, and at the end, the editing. I think I read my book 6 or 7 times before it was completed, the editing was completed. And you just better love what you're doing.
Jill, where can we find your book?
Soon you'll be able to find my book in the Glenview Walgreens and Jewel, and Barnes & Noble you can buy it at. You can buy it on Amazon, which was just so exciting to be on Amazon instead of buying from Amazon. And what I'm working on right now is I'm hoping to sell it at the Glenview Farmers Market.
Oh, yes.
So then I can be there, and if anybody has questions or...
They do that. There is a community booth that you have to sign up for, and then they have a availability over something like 3 weeks or so. So you have to sign up.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so
it'll be great.
I'm looking into that, and
part of that Glenview community.
But it's exciting. It's kind of neat to have, I don't know, a book.
Thank you, Jill, for bringing us closer to Glenview of so many years ago.
Oh, the whole thing was just a labor of love. And again, thank you for having me and let me talk about it. And I wish your show was 2 hours long so I could go on and on. But thank you very much.
Yeah. And thank you for watching. Join us next time on Off the Shelf.